Hey guys, Buildzoid here, and today we're going to be taking a look at another DDR5 overclock, this time 96 gigabytes of DDR5 with Ryzen. So the CPU that I'm using here is a Ryzen 9 7950X on a Asrock B650 LiveMixer motherboard. I purchased both the CPU and the motherboard, so big thank you to the channel supporters for making purchases like that possible. And the memory kit that I'm using here is a Corsair Vengeance RGB 6000 CL30 2x48GB memory kit. And that was provided by Corsair, so big thank you to them for sending over the memory kit. The memory chips that are used in this kit are 24 gigabit Hynix MDI, and it's a dual rank kit because you need 2 ranks of 24 gigabit memory chips to get 48 gigs on a memory stick, right? So yeah, it is a dual rank DDR5 setup. And as you can see, I have a fan sitting on top of the memory sticks. It's just held in place by gravity because this is a horizontal test bench, so yeah, if you were wondering, like, because I've seen people ask about how that fan is held in place, it isn't. It's just sitting there. And the thing is, I would highly recommend that you get a fan if you're pushing any of the higher capacity DDR5 setups, because DDR5 tends to run kind of warm, and if you have a lot of it, it just runs hotter, right? And that will really limit what you can do in terms of especially the refresh interval timing, and that timing is really important from a performance perspective. Some of the other timings are also affected by high temperatures, but not as much. So anyway, so yeah, I'd basically, if the priority is performance, the fan is kind of a necessity as far as I'm concerned with DDR5. So yeah, so that's the setup here. And now let's take a look at the stress tests. So I ran over like 4 hours of Y-Cruncher VT3. So you can see 8,000 seconds over here, and then another 8,000 seconds over here. And then for the memory stress test, I just run Karhu, and that was for an entire day with the CPU cache enabled. Now, unfortunately, these memory sticks are affected by the like temperature bug that is actually very common with DDR5. Actually, I'm not sure I have any memory sticks that don't do that eventually. So we don't actually know what temperature these were running at. Though, well, actually, you can guess, because if the sensor bugs out to 63.8, then the memory sticks were almost certainly not above 50 degrees Celsius. If it bugs out to like 70, I think the next, there's like specific temperatures that it bugs out to. I think the next one up is like 78.9 or something. And that's what you get if the memory sticks are running at around 60 degrees Celsius. So these were running at like 50 or less. Which is what you'd expect when you have a fan sitting on top of your memory sticks in a room that sits around 20 degrees Celsius, right? The ambient temperature obviously plays a role, which is something to keep in mind if you're, overclocking your memory in a system with like a really hot air-cooled GPU, like say a 4090. As the GPU will potentially significantly affect the temperature of the memory sticks. Now, obviously, if you have an open-air test bench, you don't have to worry about the GPU because there's no, the test bench isn't going to trap the hot air from the GPU in the, case, because it's not a case. But anyway, so, yeah, that's the stress test that I ran. And, yeah, I honestly, I would consider that, I'd daily this. I say absolutely no, I would consider this stable at this point. So, yeah, I guess let's go take a look in the BIOS to see what kind of settings I'm using here. Am I forgetting anything? Oh, right, I guess I should have pointed out that, there's no errors, but it's Ryzen 7000. I've never actually seen errors down here for Ryzen 7000. That's more like a Ryzen 5000 or Intel CPU thing. So, yeah, I'm not entirely sure why Ryzen 7000 doesn't really, seem to produce these kinds of errors. In my experience, it either, you can get it to, error out in stress tests and stuff, but, yeah, I've not seen it produce, correctable errors, I guess. Anyway, let's restart and take a look at the settings in the BIOS. And with that, I've committed to this video take, so hopefully nothing goes wrong at this point. I should have memory context restore enabled, so yeah, that fires right up. Capture card's being a bit slow. really slow. There we go. Anyway, so here we are in the BIOS, and as you can see for the voltages, VDDIO, so memory speed, I'm at 6200, Infinity Fabric is at 2066, so this is because there is a very slight latency advantage if you're running a 2 to 3 Infinity Fabric, and it is 2 to 3, like, this is one thing that, like, trips people up, but it is, so we're going to pull out the calculator. So, DDR5-6000, right, this is a, like, data rate. So this is not an actual frequency. This is, like, 6,000 megabits per second per pin on the memory stick, or, like, 6 gigabits per second per pin on a memory stick. And the actual clock that is used, like the memory clock, the memory controller clock, if you have your UCLK equals MCLK, well, that's going to be 3,000 megahertz, so 3 gigahertz. And so 3 gigahertz, and at 6,000 you usually have like 2,000 FCLK, right? So that's 3 to 2. And so at 6,200, you have kind of the same thing where you do 6,200 divided by like 3, and that actually ends up being 2066. But again, like the memory controller right now is running at 3,100, right? Which if you divide by 3 and then multiply by 2, you end up with that 2066. And there is actually a very, very slight latency advantage for the 2 to 3 ratio that you can completely negate if you just run a really, really high FCLK. So for example, on like 6,000, if you can run like, say, 2133 or 2166 or 2200, that's actually just better than running like 2000 with 6000. And then for 6200, it's kind of the same thing. It's like 2166 or 2200 is actually going to be faster than 2067, which is what I'm running here. But the concern is that if you're pushing the Infinity Fabric, that can cause a lot of really annoying to troubleshoot performance issues, because the Infinity Fabric on Ryzen 7000 doesn't really crash unless it's extremely unstable. But it will cause things like audio cutouts, stutters, just so you don't really like if you don't want to spend a lot of time verifying that the Infinity that your Infinity Fabric is stable, I would generally recommend that you stick to speeds lower than like 2133. And 2133 at 6200 is not really, like, that doesn't actually make sense to run. Though if, like, with some CPUs, 2200 is very easy to do. So if I had one of those, then obviously I would just go to 2200. But this chip is not that strong in the Infinity Fabric department. And also, we're running kind of high SoC voltage for 6200. I'm not 100% certain that it's completely necessary, but on some CPU, well, for like this CPU, I think I could actually get away with less SoC voltage, but there's other CPUs where 1.25 is absolutely necessary to run just DDR5-6200. And the reason I bring that up is as you run higher SoC voltages, your Infinity Fabric stability actually gets worse. So you end up like getting limited to basically Infinity Fabric speeds below 2133. Like, that's kind of been my experience. Like, if you want to run like 2200 FCLK, you probably can't run the SoC voltage higher than like 1.2. And at that point, you might be wondering, oh, so is it like better to run more FCLK at lower memory clocks so you can run low SoC voltage? And the answer is no. The memory controller, you're always better off running more memory clock than like sacrificing memory clock for FCLK. So yeah, the priority is always memory clock. So like 6200 with 2066 Infinity Fabric is just faster than 6000 with like 2200 Infinity Fabric. So that's why we're with these settings right here. Like, I would expect the vast majority of CPUs to actually be able to run this. I don't have a Ryzen 7000 chip that can't do these settings. So, yeah, though I think, at least, especially on the newest AGSAs, I really don't think you're going to find a CPU that can't do 6200. Because I have heard, like, early on there was some CPUs that wouldn't do 6200, but with the newest AGSAs, the memory overclocking has gotten somewhat better. So, yeah, anyway. So that's the, like, memory speed, Infinity Fabric, 6200 to 2066, which is one of the, like one of the options that's like a good for performance, right? Because the other option would have been like 6200 with like 2200, or if I had a really, really good CPU, then you'd be aiming at like 6400 with 2133 Infinity Fabric, but I don't have a CPU that does 6400, so that's on the memory, so that's kind of that. Anyway, SoC voltage is at 1.25, which is a bit high for the CPU at 6200, but there are other CPUs that you're going to need 1.25 at 6200, so that's that. VDDG voltages, I have those at 0.9, VDDP at 1.1, and VDDP is very motherboard dependent, and in my experience, the best stress test for figuring out like your VDDP setting is Ycruncher VT3. Like, it crashes really fast if your VDDP is way off, though usually it's more helpful at high memory speeds rather than at like kind of low ones like 6200. At like 6200, the VDP voltage, there's like a very large range of values that work, whereas if you're at something like, say, 7600, 7800, 8000, the range of options that you have for VDDP that are actually going to be stable are a lot narrower, and they get narrower the higher the memory speed you're trying to push. And they also, like the VDDP, heavily depends on the board. Like, some boards like it pretty low, some boards like it pretty high. But that's mostly a concern, again, if you're pushing like very, very high memory speeds, which we're not really doing here. Right, 6200 really isn't anything that, like, I don't consider it very high. But yeah, so 1.1 volts VDDP, like, that's perfectly safe for the CPU. Is it minimized? No. There's a chance it might have worked at a lower value. I just don't really see any reason to go and like do that. Because yeah, if it works, then that's kind of good enough for me, and it's a safe voltage. So yeah, not concerned about that. Now for the memory voltages, you'll notice that I have VDDIO at 1.4. Which might seem really high in comparison to some of to what I usually use on, say, Gigabyte boards. And this is just a difference between like Asrock and Gigabyte boards. Gigabyte boards tend to like the VDDIO voltage pretty low. Asrock boards tend to like it pretty high, is my experience. So 1.4 volts it is, because that works. In fact, I think when I was doing dual rank on a Gigabyte board, I was at like 1.25 for VDDIO. And yeah, like on Asrock boards, generally you're probably gonna end up running like 1.4, like 1.35, 1.4. In fact, I'm pretty sure with some memory kits, admittedly not on this BIOS version, what are we on? Where is the BIOS version? Yeah, so not on this BIOS version, but on some past BIOS versions, I'm pretty sure I was running like 1.4 VDDIO on, even with the like memory voltages at like 1.35. So that's just like a board-to-board difference. There's no reason to be like, this is not concerning from like, oh, is it going to damage the CPU? It's not, because this just goes to the memory controller, and so that's really not a concern. Like in fact, a lot of motherboards will just default to using the XMP voltage, which is like 1.4, just for VDDIO, VDD, VDDQ, set them all equal, and that works on some boards. It doesn't necessarily, but not on all boards, right? So on Asrock boards, generally, you're probably going to be using higher VDDIO values than if you're on like a Gigabyte board. So anyway, so VDDIO at 1.4. Admittedly, I didn't really do a ton of tuning on. Actually, I do think I tried it somewhat lower, but that wasn't working for whatever reason. It might not have even posted. But anyway, so 1.4 on VDDIO, memory voltage at 1.52, and that's because we're at 6200 CL28. If we were at like 6200 CL30, then I could probably get away with significantly less VDD voltage, but CL28 looks cooler than CL30, so that's my justification for that. And then VDDQ are at 1.4, because I do like to, so like I generally stick to just like VDDIO and VDDQ should be the same thing rule. It's not a law. Like, there are certain scenarios where you might find certain boards or certain memory kits or certain CPUs that prefer having VDDIO and VDDQ at different voltages, but in my experience, just setting both of them to the same value tends to work pretty well. So I kind of stick to that. But, you know, and if that works, then I'll just leave it at that, because, again, it's just, I don't see a reason to try fix things that aren't broken. when it comes to the voltages, right? So like 1.4, like this is literally the XMP voltage for this memory kit, which I guess I should have pointed out. Like this memory kit does not have an expo profile, but that doesn't affect anything. So yeah. But yeah, so 1.4 IO, 1.4 VDDQ, this is just like ASRock things, and then the memory voltage is, well, the VDD voltage is 1.52 because I wanted to run CL28. Also, what's kind of neat is that this memory kit on this BIOS version with this motherboard does have working high voltage support, right? Like we can actually run more than 1.43 volts on the memory, so that's pretty neat. I'm happy to see that that works, because it used to be that on AM5 motherboards, a lot of the time, if you tried to go over 1.43 volts, the system just wouldn't post, because the board would just not be able to boot the memory sticks. So I'm like, that's the other reason I decided to go with like CL28, was just to also test if the high voltage mode is working here. So anyway, so that's the voltages. Nothing really that different from what I would usually, well, I mean, compared to Gigabyte boards, the different VDD-IO and VDDQ, but other than that, basically typical Ryzen things as far as I'm concerned. Now then, let's take a look at the timings. I did enable the DFE read training. I'm not actually certain that that made much of a difference to anything, but it doesn't hurt, so I turned that on. And then gear down mode, I decided to leave it on auto because this is a dual rank setup, and I really didn't feel like dealing with any potential instability that would occur if I turned it off. Though it would slightly improve performance if I did. So yeah, I just don't really see any point in doing that for what is supposed to be like a daily, stable overclock instead of benchmark score, like something that prioritizes benchmark scores. Then for timings, we've got TCL at 28, TRC-DRD at 37, TRP at 32. This is just like Hynix 24 gigabit MDI things. You can set TRP pretty low. TRAS at 30, TRC at 62. For TRC, I just stick to the rule of adding TRP and TRAS together, and that's what your TRC should be. That rule is not set in stone. You can break it, but if you're like generally setting your TRC equal to TRP plus TRAS is not going to cause stability issues. So I like to stick to that because that works pretty well. I like to stick to that if I just want something that works rather than, trying to max out performance for a benchmark where stability isn't really a concern. Anyway, then write recovery time at 48, which is the register limit, though ASRock, for whatever reason, lets you set it to 42, which I'm not sure how they're doing that, because as far as I know, the register limit is 48. So I've set it to 48 because that's the register limit as far as I know. I don't, there's a decent chance that setting it to 42 just doesn't do anything. Anyway, refresh interval is at 65,000, so that's completely maxed out. And the fan, in order to be able to do that, you absolutely need a fan, especially with the voltages that, honestly, this memory comes with at stock, right? Like, this memory kit comes with 1.4 volts as XMP, and it is dual rank. And so even at 1.4 volts, admittedly, I'm running at 1.52 here to get that CL28 to work, but even at 1.4, these will run warm enough that you won't be able to do 65,000 without a fan over them. They will actually just get too hot to run 65,000 refresh interval without the fan, even at 1.4 volts. So, yeah, that's something to keep in mind. So if you have a dual rank kit and you're trying to you're setting the refresh interval on it pretty high, and you're noticing instability and your memory stick temperatures are approaching 60 degrees, you probably need to do something about the cooling. Because, yeah, that is not going to work. So, anyway, then refresh cycle, I have that at set to 644. It could probably go lower. I didn't try minimizing it. I don't really see a point in trying to minimize it when, a refresh cycle of 644 with a refresh interval of 65,000 is the memory is going to spend 1%, less than 1% of its runtime actually refreshing. So lowering this value further is not really going to make much difference to the performance at this point. right? So yeah, that's kind of that. TRP at 12, TRDL at 12. So TRP at 12, this is generally about as low as you can go with Hynix memory sticks for TRP. A lot of the time, and not always, but like this is just like a TRP value that generally works in the like DDR5 6000-ish range. Anyway, TRDL at 12. This could probably do 10, but with DDR5, TRDL is like a timing that the memory controller really does its best to avoid using, so it's not really a big priority to run that as low as possible. And then TRRDS is at 8 because 24 gigabit MDI, like there are other Hynix memory chips where you can run TRRDS at like 4. 24 gigabit MDI is not one of them. Like sometimes you can sometimes push it a little bit below 8, but it really it's not going to do 4. And it's also worth noting that with DDR5 the burst length is 8 cycles, so pushing the TRRDs like below 8 does still have some very minor performance benefits, but it's just like usually like unless you're on a memory unless you have a memory kit where it's like, oh, it definitely works at 4, I don't really see a point in like fine-tuning TRRDS in increments of 1 clock cycle, because it just, you know, like it's not going to do much. TFAW at 32 because with a TRRDS of 8, there's no point setting TFAW below 32. So that's kind of that. Then write to read long is at 16. Write to read short is at 4. I didn't try minimizing these. I think 14 and 4 also tends to work a lot of the time. But yeah, like these are values I just kind of default to with Hynix memory kits because they work almost always. And when it comes to like stable memory overclock, like this is basically the kind of time, I'm pretty sure this is exactly the same, like mostly the same. Okay, my daily system's TRRDs are different, but WTR, this is, I'm pretty sure the same settings that I'm running on my daily system, which also uses Hynix memory. So anyway, and then we get to our back-to-back timings. So read to read SCL, we're at 4. Which is generally as low as it goes at 6200. Then for the same DIM and different DIM, so these are the dual rank timings. Those are at 6.6. I think 5.5 might actually work, but I didn't bother to check. And then right to right, I just set it to 4. It would almost certainly work at like 2. Actually, it would probably also work at 1. But the right to right timings are generally not much of a like performance bottleneck, so you know. It's like the funny thing with tuning DDR5 is like the vast majority of the performance gain happens from just setting the refresh interval to 65,000, and then everything else is just kind of like, eh. It doesn't really, like a lot of it just doesn't really make that much of a difference. And then the right to read same dual rank timings, I have those at 8 because interestingly enough, with dual rank memory for DDR5, like the write-to-write timings typically end up being worse than the read-to-read timings. So like they're not stable if you set them lower than that. So yeah, 8 on those, and then write-to-read is at 4, and read-to-write is at 16, which is just like I'm pretty sure that's just like my typical Hynix memory timings again. So yeah, not exactly. Like, I wouldn't consider these timings some kind of, you know, amazing new discovery, because they're not. But if you have a dual rank kit, like if you have like these, like a 2x48GB kit, I would expect it to be able to do timings very similar to this. And if you want to run it at lower voltage, you could basically just do the following. And the thing is, like, in my experience with Hynix memory kits, the biggest variance is actually in the primary timings, not the secondaries. You can basically copy paste from kit to kit to kit, and they'll basically always work. But the primary timings is where you get a lot of the variance. And so, you know, like, if I had to guess, the very worst Hynix kit that you could end up with would end up doing something like this, basically. Right, this is, which for 6200, like, that is actually very loose, but you might be able to find some kits where like 32, 39, 39, 30 is what you need to run at like 1.4 volts. I would actually expect most kits could probably work at something like 32, 38 at 1.4 or like 30, 38. Oops, something like that for 1.4 volts. But yeah, if you don't really want to think about it, you could just set it to like 32, 38 or 32, 39, and then it's just kind of guaranteed. Like I would say basically guaranteed to work. Not literally, because there's always weird exceptions with any memory overclocking, but I'd be very surprised if you found a memory kit that wouldn't do, 32, 38 or 32, 39. Anyway, so we're going to go back to the settings that I actually stress tested here. And yeah, that's kind of that. Like, this was a very this was a very easy to set up memory overclock. Like the biggest issue I had is I kept trying to run the TRCD at 36. It did not like that. Like when I started off, I was like, oh, I'm gonna try TRCD 36, and on a lot of like say Hynix 16 gigabit MDI kits, I would actually expect that to work, but 24 gigabit MDI tends to be a bit looser on the primary timings. So yeah, like I'm not like the whole like, oh, it doesn't do TRCD 37 is actually like, I mean, TRCD 36 at 6200 is not really that surprising. So that was mostly like me having issues with that was mostly me being stubborn. Yeah, that's it. Like there's not really anything else. Like we've gone over the voltages, and the frequencies and the timings and oh, I guess I should have mentioned that like for the VDDG voltages 0.9 is just like this works always. In my experience, like it's kind of on the high side. You could also go with like 0.85, but yeah, I just go with like 0.9. It's not like it makes much of a difference if it's 0.85. I think even 0.8 often will work just fine, but yeah. I will point out, though, with the VDDG voltages, you definitely don't want to set them above, like, 1 volt, because that, in my experience, can cause some weird stability issues. Like, you can set them too high, but that's, like, north of 1 volt, especially for the I/O die voltage. That one tends to cause the most issues if you set it really high. So, yeah, that's 96 gigs of DDR5 with a 7950X on a B650 LiveMixer, and honestly, like, very, very simple to set up. Like this was really not particularly complicated in any way, shape, or form. I mean, admittedly, I didn't, try to minimize absolutely every single one of the timings, but from a performance perspective, this is already going to be way faster than the memory kit's XMP profile, because the auto timings for XMP profiles are terrible, and the auto timings on Expo profiles are also pretty terrible. So that's not like a knock against the kit being like an XMP kit. That's just like the default timings for for memory kits in general are not very good. And I will actually say that with DDR5, like with DDR4, you could get some memory kits that had like absolutely atrocious subtimings, like literally making the memory kit slower than if you just didn't enable the XMP profile. With DDR5, I've not run into that. Like the DDR5 auto timings, generally the manufacturers seem to just stick to the JEDEC guidelines, so you don't get anything where it's like, oh, you turn on the XMP profile and then the memory kit gets slower. That doesn't happen. It's just it also doesn't pick up that much performance because the auto time, like the subtimings don't really, like those aren't really like, well, they're not optimized, I guess is one way you could put it. But like they just sort of follow the like typical JEDEC expected like delays in nanoseconds. So yeah, anyway, that's it for the video. So hopefully you find this interesting or helpful if you're actually trying to overclock a 96 gig kit with a Ryzen CPU. Big thank you to Corsair for providing the memory kit, and big thank you to the channel supporters for funding the CPU and the motherboard. And that's it for the video, so thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comment section below. If you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, I have a Patreon. There's a link to that down in the description. There's also the AHOC Teespring store, and there's the... well, I guess now it's spring, isn't it? Anyway, there's like a merch store. There's a link in the description. And then I've also got a Bandcamp. There's a link to that in the description as well. It'd be much appreciated if you check them out. And that's it for the video. So thank you for watching, and goodbye.